Thank you for coming to the Yale University Art Gallery. It is a delight to confront a logistical problem such as we're wrestling with now. Thank you all for making it possible, and my apologies to my colleagues. I'm Larry Cantor, the chief curator here at the gallery, and it is my pleasure and very, very special privilege to introduce our speaker today to you. John Walsh graduated from Yale College in 1961, moving to New York to take MA and PhD degrees in art history from Columbia University. From 1970, he was curator in the Department of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, leaving there, wisely, to become professor of art history at Barnard in Columbia, and subsequently transferring to Boston as curator of paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, where he also served as visiting professor of fine arts at Harvard. In 1983, John assumed the directorship of the J. Paul Getty Museum, an institution then just finding its voice and which he led through its most dramatic period of growth, retiring in 2000. John is the author of many articles, books, and exhibition catalogs in his field of specialization, Dutch paintings of the 17th century, as well as in the field of contemporary art, having organized exhibitions of the painter Sheridan Lord, the painter printmakers Ed Ruscha and Leon Kossoff, and the video artist Bill Viola. Since 2000, as director emeritus of the Getty, John has been a member of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and since 2003, he has been teaching intermittently here at Yale, both in the Department of the History of Art and at the Gallery, where he is a long-standing member, some would say the cornerstone of our governing board. Perhaps the most generous of John's numberless commitments to Yale is the program he has been leading at the Art Gallery every autumn for the past, 8 years, 8 years? 6 weeks or more of total immersive coaching for a select and competitive pool of graduate students from disciplines all across campus, closely studying works of art in the original as training to be Wordle gallery teachers, a program that has come to be recognized nationally as a paradigm in the field of museum education. Many of my moments of greatest pleasure and satisfaction working here at Yale over the past decade have arisen out of close collaboration with John Walsh, teaching with him, watching him teach, and most recently toiling shoulder to shoulder with him and with our director, Jock Reynolds, to convince Eike and Rosemary van Otterlo that the Yale University Art Gallery could be a deserving place to send part of their peerless collection of Dutch 17th century paintings on loan for a period of time. Any enterprise undertaken with John Walsh is doomed to succeed. The spectacular success of this last enterprise is now evident in our galleries upstairs and is the reason we are assembled here this afternoon. In addition to his generosity in offering a seminar this spring semester on this golden age in Dutch art for 12 of Yale's luckiest undergraduates, John has prepared a series of 6 lectures to be presented publicly in this auditorium every Friday through the end of February. A little more than a year ago, John delivered a memorable series of 12 public lectures entitled Let This Be a Lesson: Heroes, Heroines, and Narrative Paintings at Yale. No doubt many of you recall those lectures as I do, with a warm glow of pleasure. For those of you who were unable to be here, do not despair. Thousands of viewers have enjoyed them through videotapes that are still available on the gallery's website. In that series, John led us masterfully across 2 continents and 5 centuries of artistic production. This spring, he intends to concentrate his gaze on one small but amazingly productive country in the north of Europe during a span of no more than 75 years. Each of his lectures using a single work of art as a lens to focus our attention on the artist who made it and on the intellectual and political context of the world in which it came into being. There are invitation cards for this lecture series in the hallway outside. Please feel free to take as many as you like and be sure not to miss a single Friday afternoon. Allow me to conclude by reviewing one ground rule that I know John will rehearse if I do not. Please take a moment now to silence your cell phones. This lecture is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the gallery's YouTube channel within the next week. Thank you very, very much. Please join me now in welcoming John Walsh.
Thank you, Larry. In this series of lectures, as Larry said, rather than giving you a chronological survey of Dutch 17th century painting, I'm going to talk about 6 pictures and explore them one at a time, in each case looking at the artist and contemporary works of the same type and the forces that shaped them. So this isn't going to be a survey, but a somewhat disorderly one. But with enough careful looking by you and some background reading by you, I think the big picture of the Golden Age will emerge. I'm going to begin here with a painting in the galleries upstairs. Let's begin just by looking at it for a minute or so, keeping in mind that the picture itself is about 6 feet wide. Well, what we're seeing is an assemblage of people, mostly males, wearing little or nothing but their own skins, which come in quite a range of tones, from a ruddy pink to kind of mother of pearl. They have astonishing physiques and complex poses to show them off. Without a label, it's not immediately apparent what is going on in the picture. We see people climbing uphill. We see them climbing trees. We see other people in distress, some of them looking upward, making imploring gestures. There's a whole cluster of hands gathered in the very middle of the picture for a kind of combined dramatic effect. It's quite hard to see what's in the distance. There's a deep void in the center that the figures surround. But with effort, you may be able to make out what looks like, I'm thinking a farmhouse with water that reflects the dark sky, and on higher ground, what looks like a building. That's vague, but I think it can only be the superstructure of the Ark of Noah. And these people are going to miss the boat. They're some of the sinful humans described in Genesis who so infuriated God that he sent a flood to wipe them all out, all except his chosen family of Noah and a great many pairs of animals. What we see is a tremendous display of futility. And the men here at the lower left are struggling to bring their belongings up to higher ground. At the far right, this mother tries to shield her child. And all of these prime specimens of the race that God created in his own image are doomed because they've wasted their lives, and all they can do now, ironically, is display the very physical perfection that God gave them. Of course, this artist goes well beyond mere perfection. He's showing off. He's punishing, and he is taking human physiques and pushing them beyond their normal capacities. He's making them more powerful, more graceful, more flexible than we'd be likely to find in real life. He's exaggerating the contrasts of near and far by strange, abrupt juxtapositions, very small next to nearly life-size. Some figures, like the one on the left, which you might be able to see, are tiny and just sketched in gray. He's composed the picture with very conscious devices to weave figures together in large patterns, like this great serpentine that goes all the way to the top of the painting. Conscious devices that give shapes and that correspond to each other, that rhyme, you could say, like the man and the woman at the right, whose curves are echoed by the body of the man at the far left. Now, none of this is really telling the story of the biblical deluge. The artist assumes you know your Genesis. He's demonstrating his extreme virtuosity by inventing a kind of hyper-expressive dance, expressing the emotions that would be generated by this situation of terror, fear of abandonment, remorse, a kind of deluded wish to protect your possessions, and so on. You may be thinking, okay, what's Dutch about this? You may have come here expecting to see realistic views of daily life and the land and the sea and the flowers and the food. The image, after all, it gives Dutch painting its character. I'm starting here, just before the turn of the 17th century, because paintings like this are the first to give artists from the northern Netherlands real international standing. They're part of a great and sudden flourishing of art, just at the time the northern provinces were about to gain de facto independence from Spain. The so-called Golden Age was beginning. Now let's step back for a few minutes and let me remind you of the geopolitical situation. Geography first. This is the modern Netherlands and Belgium, and the red line separates them. Above the red line is what we call the Netherlands, and sometimes shortened to Holland, whose products and people we call Dutch. The red line is the boundary with modern Belgium. You sometimes hear the area to the south called Flanders, and its products Flemish. In the 17th century, things were different. The boundary was actually a military frontier, a ceasefire line, like Korea today, that eventually hardened into a political division. Originally, it was all called the Netherlands, or Belgium, derived from the ancient Roman Gallia Belgica, and it consisted of 17 provinces. It had a mascot, the lion of the Belgians. This is a famous and I think mildly hilarious map of the 17 provinces of the Netherlands in the shape of the lion of Belgium. Now notice that there's no red line through his middle. In 1609, it was all still part of Spain, despite 50 years of rebellion and a declaration of independence by the 7 northern provinces against their Spanish overlords. A rebellion that had just been suspended in that year, 1609, by a 12-year truce. A century earlier, before it was Spanish, all this territory had been under the Dukes of Burgundy, and then it passed to Charles V, the man on the throne here, the Holy Roman Emperor, a member of the Habsburg dynasty, who was born in the Netherlands, in Ghent. What you see in this picture much later is, as you say, Charles in the center, abdicating in 1555 and being succeeded by the Spanish king, Philip II, on the right. Well, Philip, who was a Catholic, inherited lots of trouble. There was a growing Protestant minority who made up many sects and increasingly militant. On top of that, for centuries, the ruling elites of the Netherlandish cities and towns, who'd been accustomed to a great deal of privilege and to local rule, were not at all keen on being controlled by an activist monarch and his centralizing agents. And they didn't like being taxed either to support the king's armies in his various foreign wars. The situation got much worse when 400 dissatisfied nobles, mostly Protestant, petitioned the king to abolish the Inquisition, which was a Spanish royal court that tried cases of Catholic heresy, because it undercut their own ancient judicial functions. There was famine all over the southern provinces, and unemployment and general dissatisfaction, and in 1566, militant Protestants sacked Catholic churches, destroyed altarpieces and statues and stained glass images, which were thought idolatrous by extreme Calvinists who behaved kind of like the Taliban, and more than once. 2 years later, the leader of the rebellious Protestants, Prince William of Orange, and his brothers, who had taken refuge in Germany, invaded the Netherlands. And this was the start of a war of liberation against Spain that lasted 80 years. A kind of volunteer Protestant navy soon succeeded in taking the major port towns in Holland and Zeeland. The war was not one continuous struggle with a defined front line, but a series of sporadic campaigns using mercenary soldiers. So success depended as much on the supply of money to pay the soldiers as it did on courage or opportunity. The Spanish sieges of northern cities like Haarlem and Alkmaar and Leiden caused terrific suffering to the civilian populations. After the rebel armies managed to repel the Spanish, resistance became part of the Dutch foundation myth. Resistance by their own fortitude and resistance by the favor of God. Here you see the starving population of Leiden being fed with white bread and herring after their rescue. Stories like this came to define the character of the new independent political entity that had emerged in 1571. And even today, on the 3rd of October in Leiden, white bread and herring are distributed to citizens at the municipal weigh house. I've been there. In that year, the so-called States General of the 7 northern provinces, which was actually just the combined legislatures of each province, passed the so-called Act of Abjuration, declaring their independence from Spain. But soon, Spanish armies succeeded in recapturing major cities in the south that had been held by Protestants, including Brussels and Antwerp, the most powerful cultural and commercial metropolis of Northern Europe, and the seat of the Protestant rebellion. Now, that Spanish recapture of Antwerp had an ironic, unintended benefit for the enemy northern provinces. It drove most of the Protestant population out of the city, including tens of thousands of skilled artisans and artists, many of whom settled in the northern provinces, where they spoke the same language and where the culture was the same as the one they knew. That emigration accelerated the growth of the economy and the culture of the north. On top of that, the Spanish, during their siege in Antwerp, had blockaded the city by building this engineering wonder, a pontoon bridge across the river Scheldt, so that merchant ships couldn't come or go. Under the terms of the truce in 1609, the Spanish got to keep the city, but the northerners were allowed to continue the blockade. The effect was that Amsterdam very quickly replaced Antwerp as the import-export capital of the north. Well, our artist, Abraham Bloemaert, was born to a Catholic family in 1566, the year that the Protestant insurgency turned to violence all over the southern provinces. Churches were sacked, images destroyed by zealots, as you saw a moment ago. Bloemaert's father was a sculptor and an engineer, and he moved north to Utrecht, an ancient bishopric near Amsterdam with a population still at least half Catholic and with long ties to Rome. In fact, 50 years before this, a bishop of Utrecht had been elected Pope Adrian VI, the last non-Italian pope until 1978. Generations of Netherlandish artists had gone to Rome to study and then returned home to paint for churches and private or municipal patrons. This is the Antwerp artist Frans Floris, the greatest painter of his generation, who obviously made a study of Michelangelo's heroic nudes, as you can see from his St. Michael here in the center, and brought his revolutionary imagery back to Antwerp with him. And by the way, Peter Bruegel traveled to Italy too, and he was also impressed by Michelangelo's figures. You can see this in the physique of this farmer striding forward, but what he learned, he mostly applied to his métier of peasant life and human folly, embodied in folk wisdom, as seen from the viewpoint of a city-dwelling, well-educated, skeptical humanist. Bloemaert's training and early career are mostly undocumented. His biographer, Karel van Mander, on the left, who, by the way, was one of those emigre artists from Spanish Netherlands, knew Bloemaert permanently, but he could only give the names of a couple of obscure artists as his teachers. He doesn't say that Bloemaert went to Italy, or in fact that he ever left the Netherlands, but it's obvious that Bloemaert got a strong dose of Italian pictorial ideas at second hand from other artists. Bloemaert emerges at about the time of the Yale painting, actually, in the early 1590s, at about 25 years old, with a series of perfectly amazing performances. Van Mander says that this painting of 1591, 8 feet wide, was intended for none other than the Holy Roman Emperor at Prague, Rudolf II. It shows the horrific scene of, in the Metamorphoses of Ovid, of Apollo and Artemis shooting all 14 children of Queen Niobe, Niobe who made the mistake of mocking their mother for having only 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. The result of this kind of story without much of a meaning is a tangle of the dead and the dying that he arranges in a great variety of poses. Where would such an extravagant style come from? It actually came from a group of older Netherlandish artists who'd been to Italy and been to the emperor's court at Prague. Bloemaert's timing was good. In the year 1591, he'd moved to Amsterdam, which put him close to the incubator of new ideas in the northern Netherlands, which was not Amsterdam, but Haarlem, 20 miles away. That's where the printmaker Hendrik Goltzius and the painter Cornelis van Haarlem practiced. And both of them, in turn, had been exposed to the most influential figure of the time, who was a painter from the southern Netherlands who worked for Rudolf II in Prague, Bartholomeus Spranger. Spranger had synthesized Italian figures and color into a kind of hyper-elegant style for mythological scenes like the one on the screen, a kinky version of Hercules reclaiming Deianira after shooting his rival, the centaur Nessus, who's there on the ground. A picture obviously aimed at a very sophisticated court taste. If Spranger was the flower, Van Mander was the bee. This drawing by Spranger was the pollen that he brought back from Prague to Haarlem in his luggage. An amazing drawing, a panorama of the gods in extravagantly elegant poses, which was engraved right away by Hendrik Goltzius in Haarlem, the print at the bottom. Prints like this were the means for advanced pictorial ideas to be reproduced and circulated among artists and their patrons, or their hoped-for patrons, in much the way that art magazines and the web have functioned in our time. By the way, there's a Spranger show at the Met, and anybody who's missed it shouldn't be missing it. It's on, however, only until the end of this month. But it's an astonishing artist. You won't be sorry. Go down this weekend. Cornelis, I should say, the Spranger style was translated into a painting by Cornelis van Haarlem, an artist who had a taste and a clientele not only for elegance but for the violent and the grotesque. Here the subject is the fall of the Titans, story from Hesiod and also Ovid, of the victory of Zeus and the Olympians over an army of giants. There's really no narrative here. There's just a fantastic composition of male nudes in stop action, acting out extreme emotions with their bodies. There were dozens of drawings, as you can imagine, for this project, some of which Goltzius reproduced in engravings of these, in this case, of 2 overreachers who failed and fell in interesting poses. These are objects of peculiar sheer virtuosity. Bloemaert moved into exactly this milieu for a couple of years, which helps to explain the Yale painting, I think, and others like it. Soon, printmakers in Haarlem were reproducing designs by Bloemaert himself. This Raising of Lazarus was spectacularly popular. We know of no less than 25 different painted copies after this composition by Bloemaert. just to see how extreme the Dutch version of the so-called Mannerist style can be, we can compare it with another treatment of this subject here at Yale, just one room away from the Deluge by Bloemaert. That's this picture on the lower right by Bloemaert's older contemporary in Italy, Marco Pino. Bloemaert cranks up excitement here about the resurrection of Lazarus, not by the gestures of Christ and Lazarus, the main actors, but by bit players in the story, by the two grave diggers on one side and the other, with their arms flung up in amazement. Well, having mentioned the term Mannerist, I should say a little more about it. Mannerist is a term based on the Italian word maniera, which during the Renaissance meant just style. But maniera soon came to mean a particular graceful way of posing figures, which to us is apt to look arbitrary and even perverse. Along with an exaggerated elegance and an anatomically unnatural proportions would come also strange picture space that wasn't governed by the strict rules of perspective, but tended to flout them. There were also exaggerated contrasts of scale. That's striking, for example, in the Holy Family by Parmigianino on the right, and a crowding of figures, as you see on the left in Vasari's Carrying of the Cross, kind of irrational but expressive, intensifying the action. The word maniera, as I said, had referred to behavior. It meant knowing just what to do in each occasion without effort. That was maniera. You had style. Castiglione, the author of The Courtier, gave it another word, sprezzatura, a kind of easy grace. It's the savoir-faire that comes with birth and cultivation. But style could become stylishness, something Castiglione didn't admire, imitative, stereotyped, affected. Maniera could become what we call mannered. During the next century, that's how it was seen. And in the 18th century, the term mannerism was invented as a label and a put-down for the art of the later Renaissance, including Marco Pino, Spranger, Goltzius, and Bloemaert. Their works were devalued, and it took until the middle of the 20th century for mannerism to really regain respect and interest. Bloemaert's contemporary and rival in Utrecht was Joachim Uterwaal. Unlike Bloemaert, Uterwaal did travel to France and Italy, and when he returned to the Netherlands, some of that same pollen rubbed off on him at the same time, to judge from his painting of the Deluge. It's very similar in viewpoint and layout to Bloemaert's, but only a few figures actually repeat his, like the women and the child at the edges and the tree climbers. Uterwaal's people are even more contorted, and they're charged with a kind of energy right to the tips of their fingers and toes. But it is as though these two artists were looking at each other's pictures as they worked, or maybe at looking at somebody else's pictures of the subject, probably a lost version of the subject by Cornelis van Haarlem. In any case, I want to show some more pictures by Bloemaert and explore for a minute some other sides of his imagination. This is another story from Ovid, Mercury lulling Argus to sleep, Argus the giant with 100 eyes, so that he can kill him, which he's doing actually in the far distance of the picture. The poses are still complex, but they express the action, I think, more subtly. Mercury the trickster here is given a twisty pose, and the giant Argus is still asleep, but his contorted hands show he's still dangerous. The composition is less perverse, and the scene is set in a leafy landscape where the trees bend down to shelter the action and also pick up this long, sinuous curve from the hand of Argus all the way up and out of the picture. Bloemaert's development doesn't go in a straight line. A couple of years later, here's another crowd of gesticulating figures, now mostly clothed, with a prominent young woman holding a golden pitcher. It takes some hunting around to find out what's causing all the commotion, why also there are these pots and jugs strewn around. Well, in the shadows, far back on the left, if you look, you'll find Moses striking the cliff and causing water to gush out, saving the lives of thirsty Israelites in the desert. The inversion here is like the Deluge by Bloemaert. He pushes the main event to the background, and it's not just a matter of style. It affects the sense of the picture. The svelte girl in the clingy wrapper here, not exactly clothing for the desert travel, is there to embody the main idea, which Bloemaert's audience would have recognized, whether Catholic or Protestant, that the water Moses produces for the Israelites and saves them is the prefiguration of the water of Christian baptism, the water that will save souls. Bloemaert could also tell a story more straightforwardly. Here's the Old Testament Joseph as a young man who, you remember, was sent away to Egypt by his jealous half-brothers, who's now been made viceroy to the Pharaoh. And he's not giving his brothers who come to visit, not giving them the hard time they deserve. He's receiving them graciously, setting an example of magnanimity that Bloemaert probably intended as appropriate for whatever person, maybe a public official, who ordered the painting. The colors are lighter and stranger and more gorgeous even than before. The painting is composed on a broad, shallow stage space that looks almost like the pictures in Venice, and I'm talking about the sumptuous paintings on similar themes by Paolo Veronese, who was a generation younger. These were pictures that traveling painters from the Netherlands like Rubens saw when they went to Venice. That didn't include Bloemaert. In 1600, Bloemaert was 34 years old. He was just getting started. He went on painting for 50 more years, painting, teaching, making designs for prints. He was a founder of the Guild of Painters in Utrecht. He got commissions from the Prince of Orange, the court in The Hague. He got a visit from the Queen of Bohemia and by Rubens himself, the most successful painter alive, who paid him a call and praised his drawings in particular. So Bloemaert was well-to-do and famous, and he remained a Catholic, despite the official ban on practicing Catholicism, even in secret. And he kept painting explicitly Catholic subjects. In fact, some of his later pictures are altarpieces intended for secret churches or, like this one, for the Catholic southern Netherlands. This one was for the Jesuit church in Brussels in around 1624. In other words, commissioned after the truce had expired and the North and southern Netherlands were again at war, commissioned not from a northerner, like the natives Rubens or Van Dyck or Jordaens, but instead from an enemy northerner. This is a reminder that although the Netherlands had split politically, the borders were quite porous, and North and South were still, in most respects, culturally unified. Another devotional painting by Bloemaert at life size. It's worth comparing this conservative lamentation with the same subject painted by Bloemaert's contemporary in Antwerp, Antonie van Dyck. At the bottom, you see a very striking comparison. Bloemaert's figures had been extravagantly expressive in their poses. You think of the Deluge, but now they're much more natural, inward, grave. And compared to Van Dyck's Madonna and angels, particularly the angels, these act out their sorrow with eloquent gestures and a kind of loose brushwork. What has calmed the style down here in Bloemaert, what's made Bloemaert a different artist, has been that he's been exposed to another wave of Italian ideas, which came to him from his former pupils, who'd come back from Rome with more prints and their own paintings. One of those pupils was Gerard van Honthorst, who left Bloemaert and spent 4 years in Rome, starting in 1616, when he drew this careful copy of a painting by Caravaggio that he'd studied, depicting the crucifixion of St. Peter in a way, as Caravaggio painted it, so direct and so physical and so wrenching that it must have been a revelation and an inspiration, and was, to a whole generation of younger artists. These, in Caravaggio, were believable figures, ordinary men, weighty, painted with a seeming artlessness, and they were picked out of the half-darkness by strong, slanting light. Honthorst learned from devotional paintings like this, and he added something of his own, a visible source of light, a candle or a lantern. As here, Christ is being interrogated by Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, who asks him if he claims to be the Messiah, which everyone knew was blasphemy and punishable by death, according to the laws of Moses, written undoubtedly in the book that he has on the table. Everything is revealed by a simple candle. The flame is not just a light source, it's a symbol of the truth, which Caiaphas claims to be seeking and which Christ actually possesses. This is powerful stuff, and it quickly made Honthorst famous. Candlelight scenes weren't Honthorst's invention. They were a specialty of the Bassano family of painters a generation earlier, or of El Greco, too, on the right, when he was in Venice. Honthorst exploited the device in Rome and caused a lot of surprise and, I'm sure, delight among highly placed buyers, and he set off a fad for candlelight that made careers for other contemporaries, among others, the French artist Georges de la Tour. In this picture, the Magdalene contemplates her sins, and the candle becomes an object of serious meditation on life itself, both its brightness and its brevity. A whole succession of Dutch candlelight painters followed on too, well-paid, admired all throughout Europe, beginning with Rembrandt's pupil Gerard Douw, here on the left, and ending as the trademark of a rich and famous specialist in candlelit scenes, Gottfried Schalken, who paints his own portrait with the candle as a kind of magic talisman. Honthorst was one of the really influential Dutch painters of the 17th century. He imagines that when an angel comes to rescue St. Peter from prison, Peter's reaction would be to recoil, befuddled, dazzled by the light and by the young creature who's appeared, inviting him rather than commanding him. Honthorst has quite a sensitive and original sense of the psychology of a scene. Honthorst also puts light effects to work for less elevated subject matter. Here, a delicious and inviting girl, a professional entertainer, let's just say, getting an offer from a young man here who's in a plumed hat, as you see, who's clutching his money bag in his left hand, while an old woman grins and points, as though anybody might miss the point. This may be a sordid business deal, but it's painted with remarkable refinement. This is a situation we're going to find in Dutch art throughout the century. Pictures of mercenary love treated with the most exquisite visual subtlety. Look how the light models her face and chest, and also bounces up and touches the edge of his face, leaking around his profile. And look at her, the profile of the hag, the gap-toothed sort of flesh broker, eyes widening at what she sees in the boy's hand. This kind of scene of dealings between men and women, whether amateur or professional, a man lighted from behind, a woman from the front, in half length, it became a staple of artists in Utrecht and soon all over the Netherlands, north and south. It was even the model for the refined pictures of Pieter de Hoogh and Johannes Vermeer 30 years later. Another of Bloemaert's pupils became the greatest of all Dutch artists of this kind, Hendrik ter Brugghen, the most subtle and refined painter of the group, who went to Rome and came home to paint their personal variants of the international style inspired by Caravaggio. This is ter Bruggen's Calling of St. Matthew, which is his answer to the famous painting of the same subject by Caravaggio. It's a kind of compressed and reorganized version of the original. Caravaggio, as you remember, takes place in a high room with slanting light that casts sharp shadows right towards the head of the startled tax collector. Now, ter Bruggen packs a similar cast of characters, all close together, and they have a much more pungent individuality. And the blonde light plays over their costumes in a whole gamut of colors, from lavenders and blues to a warm red. And the story is told by the hands in the center, the gestures. I want you. Like, who, me? Wait a minute. We've got work to do. There's money involved here. That sort of byplay. And here, at the other end, is the astonishing crucifixion in the Metropolitan Museum with a hypnotized John the Evangelist and a haggard Mary, and an image of Christ that is harrowing, not shown as a hero who died nobly, but a tortured and defeated victim, not remotely beautiful. It was certainly made for Catholic worship, probably in a hidden church or chapel. And it's like nothing else painted in the 17th century, except possibly Rembrandt's scenes from the crucifixion, 10 years later, where Christ is a corpse that's really hard to look at. Here's a third pupil of the Honthorst ter Bruggen generation, another pupil. This is Dirk van Baburen, his best-known picture, I think. Another trio that we recognize now, the musical girl in low-cut outfit, the man with ready cash, the goings-on here, and the procuress at the right demanding her cut. The goings-on are at least as unsubtle as Honthorst, and the light and the color almost rival ter Bruggen's. We're going to see this again, this picture, in the context of Vermeer's development. Bloemaert is among the most important Dutch artists, not only for his own work, but because at one time or another he had more than 130 pupils, putting him in a very small category of influential artists that includes Rembrandt. One of his qualifications as a master was his famous skill at drawing. Drawing, the first thing that you learned as a pupil. Bloemaert had a collection of prints and drawings and plaster casts of ancient and modern statues to use for his own painting and for students to draw. That's what you see here, a pupil here with a master wearing, as sometimes done, a sort of funny hat, who's recently been identified as Bloemaert himself. And the books here, I think, are important, not just the plaster casts. The books remind you that this studio of an artist is a place of the mind, not just of manual labor. Drawing was the fundamental skill behind all this. Masters had students copy prints and drawings first, then plaster casts from all angles, and then they finally graduated to the live model. This is a painting of some 30 years later by Jan Steen, an artist we'll look at in the second lecture. It illustrates and idealizes this work of teaching. The painter has been working in the back room at the easel, and he still has his palette in his hand as he leans over, correcting the drawing made by one of his pupils, one of them being a young apprentice, very young, and the other a well-dressed girl, who may be a paying amateur, actually, in a studio full of apparatus, prints, bundles of drawings, a canvas, and a still life here ready to be painted. Rembrandt's studio offered something else, group instruction in figure drawing from live models. This was the method of academies in Italy and France. Now here you see a nude female on the right of the picture reclining. There were males too that posed. The master in the center, Rembrandt himself, is evidently correcting a pupil's drawing. After this phase, you would have advanced to actual painting, and if you were good, Rembrandt had the right to sell your work as his own, and he did. Some of Bloemaert's pupils, is that where I want to go? Yeah, you needed to draw in order to build your skills, not just of transcribing, but you also needed to learn a stepwise method of constructing a picture, a method that was practiced everywhere in Europe ever since the procedure was pretty much perfected by Raphael. If you're painting the Lamentation of Christ, as we saw before, you start with a first idea for a composition, like the one in the upper left. You make detailed studies of individual figures from the model, like the one at the upper right, and you make a final presentation drawing like the one at the far right, which, if it has the approval of your client, you then proceed to paint. Some of Bloemaert's pupils followed him on what was universally considered the high road of art, history painting, religious and mythological and historical subjects, for which there was a market in the Netherlands, north and south throughout the century. Others went in other directions. Bloemaert himself was ready to learn and adapt, including from his own pupils. Here's a picture by Bloemaert of 1621 that shows a soulful flute player in a striped Burgundian outfit, sort of decor that you've seen before in those pupils, a sort of subject that Bloemaert's alumnus Terbruggen had learned to paint from the Caravaggio circle and brought home with him. The lighting in Bloemaert's picture, of course, as you see it from the other side of this jug, comes from his other pupil, Honthorst. We have more drawings by Bloemaert than any other Dutch painter, about 1,700 drawings, and many of them are spectacularly good. When the purpose is to work out the placement and the lighting, as it is in this drawing on the right of Pyramus and Thisbe, Bloemaert uses rapid chalk lines to sketch the composition, followed by loose pen lines and washes of dilute ink. In the drawing on the left, though, here, a fabulously dressed woman swiveling gracefully away from a table loaded with every kind of expensive object. In this case, Bloemaert isn't testing possibilities with the drawing. He already knows where everything is going. That's because he's making an exact design for an engraver to follow. The subject, by the way, is the vanity of human life. You see that not only has she been accumulating expensive stuff, but for fun she's blowing bubbles. Beautiful but short-lived, like herself and us. This is a theme we'll come across many times, the vanity and dangers of self-indulgence. Figure studies are meant to test ideas, develop them or refine them, or just run with them, the way a composer does at the keyboard. They weren't meant to be sold, but to be used in the studio. So Bloemaert uses thin, flexible pen strokes for some situations here. This nude in a scene in steep for shortening, or for other purposes, like getting to the exact angle of a trumpeter's head, or the different ways he can hold the instrument. He'd use red or white chalk on colored paper. Bloemaert is a master of all these techniques. His drawings let us see another side of the artist, not just the systematic renderer of the real, but the curious, receptive observer, especially out in the landscape. The landscapes in his paintings are very obviously arranged, not taken direct from nature. There's an ambitious landscape in this scene of St. John preaching. Again, it takes a while to find the main actor, who is actually standing under the tree at the left and is again upstaged by a very big crowd of extras. The landscape is neither the biblical wilderness nor the flat countryside around Utrecht. It's the land of landscape painting of the late Renaissance, an imaginary synthetic thing made of well-observed elements and combined into fantasy. In its structure, it follows a formula used by landscape specialists at the time, such as Gilles van Koningslo, another Flemish emigre to the northern Netherlands, whose landscapes were collected all over Europe. You see it's got ancient trees bending over, raised ground in the center, and a kind of twin tunnel arrangement going into the mysterious depths of the forest. Bloemaert himself went out and observed rustic scenery. He seems to have studied bits here and there in his walks and combined them into confections like this of falling down barns and dovecots and twisting old trees and peasants doing things that a city person might not even know about, like the man at the far left here who's throwing sticks up into a tree to knock acorns down so he can gather them up for pigs who are present. A drawing like that would be stockpiled with others and used later for drawings or prints. These prints were usually the settings for biblical tales with a moral, like the prodigal son here, who's just about to be sent over from his job with the cattle to tend the pigs, in a large engraving by Jan Sanerdam that would have been based on the drawing by Bloemaert. Some of these compositions, the trees are bigger than the buildings and much more prominently placed even than the actors. The trees kind of become actors. They display their noble struggle between age and vitality and endurance. This is a theme we'll see again in landscapes by Jacob van Ruijsdael and other Dutch painters. But again, it's not new. It's a kind of topos in art. Again, it pictures nature as it had been treated by other artists. And in this case, it goes back to Titian and Venice 100 years earlier. This on the top is a woodcut made from Titian's design of the aged hermit St. Jerome in a landscape with old battered trees. And Peter Bruegel used the same idea for this drawing of the same subject, St. Jerome in the wilderness, that he made in Italy. So there are templates, you could say, that Bloemaert used, not just to give people what they're accustomed to, but to play with the formulas that he'd inherited. He observes at close range, too, sometimes. Very often things in nature, like pollarded willows here, twisted, and cabbages that are complex or quirky and hard to draw. And he was part of the great production of small, inexpensive landscape prints. That's such a progressive and exciting development of 1610 to 20 or so, mainly in Haarlem, we'll get to that, but elsewhere too. Their title pages, these print sets, typically announce that it's good for you to walk in the countryside, but if you can't, you might buy these prints and try looking at them. It's a sort of armchair tourism focused on the near and the present, not the exotic and the ancient. In Haarlem, the technique used is etching, which is much more direct than engraving. And with other artists, like Klaas Jans Visser on the right, the compositions are simplified radically, much farther than Bloemaert chooses to follow in his own sets of prints on the left. Bloemaert's own virtuosity and itch to show off never quite entirely relaxes. Well, landscape had absolutely no appeal for the first generation of Bloemaert's pupils in Utrecht, Honthorst, Brugge, and Baburen. They were devoted to life-size figure painting. But the next wave of his pupils, who went to Italy, found other things to admire and other career opportunities. This is Cornelis van Poelenburg, who came back to Utrecht after 8 years in Rome, having learned to make small pictures of Italian scenery with prominent ancient ruins. At the left is the Roman Forum, the then called the Campo Vaccino, long before it was excavated. Campo Vaccino because it was still used as a cow pasture. He painted miniature history paintings in Italianate settings, like the one at the top. This is the goddess Diana discovering that one of the supposedly chaste nymphs, Callisto, is pregnant by Jupiter, a favorite subject of Italian painters since Titian. The painter Jan Bot, also from Utrecht, was in Italy after his fellow Bloemaert pupil, Poulenberg, had returned. Bot saw the countryside and warm Italian sun not just as gorgeous, but even as a kind of golden land where, compared to Holland, not much labor was required, and where you never get rained on. Bot was not just looking around him. You realize he was also, like everybody else, looking at pictures as well, particularly pictures by Claude Lorrain, another northerner, who'd become the best-known poet of the Italian landscape in Rome. Jan Bot had great success back home, painting in this vein, where he helped create a big market for it. I want to come a long way back now to our starting point and consider this painting of the Deluge before we let it go. I should ask that the subject of the Deluge has a long history. For Bloemaert, that would have started with Michelangelo in Rome in the Sistine ceiling. His powerfully built refugees here represent one way to see the event, as a kind of hopeless retreat by the sinners who were still beautiful but still doomed. And by the way, another way to imagine the Deluge that Bloemaert didn't know was pushed to the limit in this huge picture across the street in the British Art Center by John Martin in the 1830s, where the flood arrives with a kind of stupefying convulsion of the earth, and we see a vast crowd of the guilty race being swept away in the tide. Well, Bloemaert's picture, what might it have meant to its audience? We looked at the amazing virtuosity in the picture, the strange and extreme body language, the fact that the figures upstage and even obscure the narrative of rising waters and the ark to the point of being the purpose of the painting, something we saw Bloemaert doing quite regularly with other subjects at the time. So was the flood in Genesis just a pretext for the display of anatomy and the artist's skill in picturing it, or possibly a demonstration of the capacity of the body to convey fear, desperation, and so on? I thought those may well have been the main motives. But here's another scene from the same narrative. The assembling of the animals that are going to go aboard the ark, 2 by 2, with no hint of trouble ahead. So did this scene have some deeper meaning beside being a reminder of the infinite bounty and ingenuity of God, his infinite power, since he created all of this, and power because he's about to destroy every creature except these? Or wasn't the main motive of the artist to please a connoisseur who could admire his skill, not to mention his knowledge of exotic species? I think the answer is yes, that was likely the purpose. And certainly Bloemaert's picture was meant to please connoisseurs of both genders with all of that bare flesh. It would have reminded at least some people of the consequences of offending God. They had heard the words of St. Paul often repeated from the pulpit: "The wages of sin is death. The gift of God is eternal life." Sin, folly, self-indulgence, intemperance, all these offenses were a constant theme of painters all through the 17th century, as we're going to be seeing. God's punishment in Genesis was a storm and rising waters. Is it an accident that the picture was painted in the Netherlands, where the gravest threat to life is flooding? Now, preachers saw the Netherlanders as chosen by God and blessed with the ingenuity not only to defend their land, but also to create their own. Low-lying delta land had to be protected by floods and dikes, from floods by dikes they built. And New land was created out of shallow lakes by draining them, by pumping water into systems of canals using mills powered by wind. The Dutch had what Simon Schama calls a diluvial personality, which I love. Like the people of the Nile and the Ganges, which flood regularly, they depend on water to renew the soil, and they live in fear of that water. Schama describes the punishment of certain criminals in Amsterdam in the 17th century by a kind of waterboarding, immersion. He writes, "To be wet was to be captive, idle, and poor. To be dry was to be free, industrious, and comfortable." So it's not far-fetched to imagine that rising water was an especially fearful punishment for people in the lowlands to contemplate. Dike breaks were terrifying to remember and were long told about. Dutch remembered them for centuries. I think that some Dutch people of Bloemaert's time, looking at the picture or at others of the subject I showed you, would certainly have had a stronger association, keener visceral sensations looking at it than, say, a person in Paris or Rome. Well, here's an engraving made not long before Bloemaert's painting, which he must have known. It represents the deluge from a similar viewpoint, with the doomed sinner naked in the foreground, the doomed sinners in the foreground, and in the far distance, the flood and the ark. Nude like Bloemaert's, they're not fleeing in terror, though. They're heedless, they're oblivious, still eating and drinking and embracing a table. This print was made with a companion piece showing humankind in a similar situation, indulging themselves, only now what's going on in the background is the Last Judgment. The ones at the table haven't learned anything. They party on. They have put on clothes, though, and what they're wearing are the chic outfits worn by contemporary, well-to-do young people. It's a lesson aimed at the spectator. Images like this of folly and self-indulgence are a staple of Dutch and Flemish painting of the 17th century. The next lecture will be about just such a picture of misbehavior by Jan Steen, who, I'm glad to say, throws in some humor. Come back next week.